A street kid approached the grand piano at an elite charity gala. "Get away from that!" Billionaire William Huntington III roared with laughter, mocking him in front of everyone. But when the boy's fingers touched the keys, the entire room fell into stunned silence. The crystal chandelier above the Huntington Grand Ballroom cast dancing shadows across marble floors, so polished they looked like frozen mirrors. Ethan Rivers stood in the service corridor, his small hands gripping the edge of a silver serving cart, watching a world he'd only ever seen through windows. He wasn't supposed to be here. Kitchen staff weren't allowed in the main hall during the annual Huntington Foundation Gala, especially not 12-year-old kitchen assistants whose mothers cleaned the toilets in this very building. But Ethan couldn't help himself. Not tonight. Not when he could hear it. The piano. A Steinway Model D concert grand, worth more than every apartment in his entire neighborhood combined, sat like a sleeping giant in the center of the ballroom. Black, perfect, untouched. Its lid propped open like an invitation Ethan had been dreaming about for 3 years. "Just once," he whispered to himself, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Just once, I need to touch it." The ballroom was a hurricane of wealth. Women dripped with diamonds that could fund a school. Men wore watches that cost more than his mother made in 5 years. They laughed with the easy confidence of people who'd never worried about electricity being shut off or choosing between medicine and food. Ethan's mother, Grace, was somewhere in the building right now, scrubbing floors on her hands and knees while these people sipped champagne that cost more per glass than she made per hour. She'd been cleaning for the Huntington family for 7 years, working double shifts since Ethan's father died, her hands raw and calloused, her back perpetually bent from labor. But tonight wasn't about anger. Tonight was about the piano. Ethan had been teaching himself music theory from library books for 3 years. He practiced on a broken keyboard he'd found in a dumpster, half the keys silent, the others sticky and unresponsive. But in his mind, in his dreams, he played on instruments like this one. He heard the resonance, felt the action of real hammers striking real strings, imagined the sustained pedal extending notes into infinity. The gala was reaching its peak. Speeches had been made. Donors had been thanked. Now came the entertainment hour, where wealthy guests mingled while a hired jazz quartet played background music that nobody actually listened to. This was his moment, maybe his only moment. Ethan abandoned the serving cart and slipped into the ballroom, staying close to the walls, moving through shadows like water. His reflection in the golden mirrors looked wrong, a smudge of poverty in a gallery of perfection. His clothes were clean but obviously second-hand, 2 sizes too big, held together with his mother's careful stitching. His shoes squeaked slightly against the marble, announcing his presence to anyone paying attention. Nobody was paying attention. To them, he was invisible, just another servant's kid, part of the machinery that kept their world running smoothly. He reached the piano. Up close it was even more magnificent. The black lacquer finish reflected his face, thin, hungry, hopeful. The keys gleamed like teeth in a beautiful smile. Ethan's fingers trembled as he reached out, barely touching the smooth surface of middle C. Cool, perfect, real. His breath caught in his throat. This close he could smell the wood polish, see the grain of the soundboard through the open lid, notice the Steinway logo gleaming in gold leaf. Just one chord, Ethan breathed, just to know what it feels like. He glanced around. The guests were clustered in groups, engrossed in conversations about stocks and vacation homes and whose yacht was bigger. The jazz quartet was on break. Security guards stood at the exits but were focused outward, not inward. Ethan sat down on the bench. The cushion was soft, real leather probably. It adjusted perfectly to his weight. His feet didn't quite reach the pedals, but that was okay. He wasn't going to play long. Just one chord. Just one moment of knowing what real music felt like. His fingers found their positions. C major. The most basic chord in music. The first thing any pianist learns. Ethan closed his eyes and pressed down. The sound that emerged was transcendent. Rich, full, resonant. Every harmonic ringing true. The notes blooming in the air like flowers opening to sunlight. It wasn't loud, but in the vastness of the ballroom, it carried. Clear. Pure. Perfect. For exactly 2 seconds, Ethan experienced joy so complete that tears sprang to his eyes. Then the voice came. Sharp, cruel, and amplified by generational wealth. "Get away from that piano!" The words cut through the ballroom like a whip crack. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to mouths. Every head in the room turned toward the piano, toward Ethan. William Huntington III stood 20 feet away, his face twisted with outrage and something else. Something that looked almost like offense that a child like Ethan would dare touch something so valuable. At 58 years old, William was the physical embodiment of old money. Silver hair perfectly styled, a tuxedo that cost more than most cars, a family legacy dating back to the Gilded Age. He owned 17 companies, sat on 12 boards, and had a reputation for crushing anyone who challenged him. And right now, he was staring at Ethan like he'd found a rat in his champagne. "What do you think you're doing?" William's voice boomed across the silent ballroom. He strode toward the piano, each step deliberate, his expensive shoes clicking against marble like a countdown. "That instrument is worth more than your whole family will ever earn." Ethan's hands flew off the keys as if they'd been burned. He stood up so quickly the bench scraped loudly against the floor. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His brain screamed at him to run, to disappear, to somehow undo the last 30 seconds. But his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen, a deer in headlights, while every wealthy guest in the room watched his humiliation. "I'm sorry, Ethan managed. "You just what?" William was closer now, towering over him. "Decided to put your filthy hands on a $180,000 instrument? Do you have any idea what you could have damaged?" "I didn't damage anything. I just played one chord." "One chord?" William's laugh was cruel, designed to humiliate. He turned to address the crowd, making sure everyone was watching. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Helps children think they can just waltz in and play our instruments. What's next? Should we let them try on our jewelry? Perhaps drive our cars?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not everyone laughed. Some people looked uncomfortable, but enough did that Ethan felt his face burning with shame. A woman in a silver gown whispered to her companion, "Aren't there rules about this sort of thing?" A man in a tuxedo shook his head with disdain. "This is what happens when you hire people from those neighborhoods. No sense of boundaries." William circled Ethan like a shark, playing to his audience. Look at him. Probably never even had a music lesson. Probably thinks chopsticks is a challenging piece. More laughter. These people watch YouTube videos and think they're musicians. It's adorable, really. Like a dog walking on its hind legs. Ethan felt something crack inside his chest. Not anger, not yet. Something deeper. A wound opening in a place that had been tender his entire life. The place where he kept his dreams, his hopes, his belief that maybe talent mattered more than money. "I do know music," Ethan heard himself say, his voice barely above a whisper. William stopped circling. His eyebrows rose with theatrical surprise. "I'm sorry, what was that?" "I said I know music." Louder now, though Ethan's voice shook. "I've been teaching myself for 3 years. I know theory, composition, technique. From books?" William's voice dripped with mockery. "You learned piano from books? Well, this is precious." He turned back to his audience. "Tell me, boy, did these books teach you that you need to actually own an instrument before you can play one? Or that some things simply aren't meant for people like you? People like me?" Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Yes, people. Like you." William enunciated each word slowly, as if speaking to someone who didn't understand English. People who don't belong in places like this. People who should know their place. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Even the uncomfortable guests had stopped shifting. Everyone was watching this collision between worlds. Old money and no money, entitlement and desperation, cruelty and dignity. Ethan felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these people who were already convinced he was nothing. "My mother works here," Ethan said, lifting his chin. "She's worked here for 7 years. She cleans your floors and your toilets and your offices. She works 16-hour days so I can eat, so I can go to school, so I can have a chance at something better." "How touching," William said with exaggerated sympathy. "And I'm sure she's very good at cleaning. But that doesn't give you the right to touch my property. That piano was donated by the Rothschild family. It's been played by concert pianists, virtuosos, Artists who've dedicated their lives to music, not by some kitchen rat who learned Mary Had a Little Lamb from a YouTube tutorial. I didn't learn from YouTube, Ethan said, his voice stronger now. I learned from books by Chopin, by Liszt, by Beethoven. I learned music theory from textbooks I borrowed from the library. I practiced on a broken keyboard I found in a dumpster. Every single day for 3 years, 4 hours minimum, even when my fingers were raw from practicing on broken keys. How tragic, William interrupted, his voice dripping sarcasm. A real Oliver Twist story. Should we all pull out our handkerchiefs? He stepped closer, lowering his voice but making sure it still carried. Let me explain something about the real world, boy. Talent without resources is just noise. You can practice 1,000,000 hours on garbage you found in an alley, and you'll still be exactly what you are right now, a poor kid who doesn't belong here. The words landed like physical blows. Ethan felt each one, felt them confirming every fear he'd ever had about himself, every doubt that crept in during those 4-hour practice sessions on a keyboard where half the keys didn't work. William, perhaps we should... A woman's voice from the crowd, attempting to de-escalate. No, this is important, William said, silencing her with a raised hand. These children need to learn boundaries. They need to understand that not everything in life is accessible to everyone. Some doors remain closed for a reason. He turned back to Ethan. Now, I'm going to call security to escort you out. But first, I think you owe everyone here an apology for disrupting our evening with your performance. Ethan's throat felt like it was closing. Apologize. For touching a piano. For daring to want something beautiful. For believing, even for a moment, that his 3 years of work and sacrifice meant anything. No, Ethan said quietly. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. William's face darkened. Excuse me? I said no. Ethan's voice was steadier now, fueled by something he didn't fully understand yet, a kind of desperate courage that came from having nothing left to lose. I'm not going to apologize for wanting to play music. I'm not going to apologize for dreaming bigger than my circumstances. And I'm not going to apologize for touching your piano. The crowd gasped. Someone actually gasped, like in a movie, like what Ethan had just said was the most scandalous thing they'd ever heard. William's face went from dark to thunderous. You little... I'll apologize to the piano for being played by someone who actually loves music instead of someone who just owns it, Ethan continued, the words tumbling out now, unstoppable. I'll apologize for bringing actual passion into a room full of people who buy art because their decorators told them to, who donate to music foundations for tax write-offs, who wouldn't know a Beethoven sonata from a Bieber song. The silence that followed was absolute. Nuclear. You could have heard a snowflake land on carpet. William Huntington III's face went through several colors in rapid succession. Red, purple, a shade that didn't have a name. His hands opened and closed at his sides. His jaw worked like he was chewing words too terrible to speak out loud. Then he smiled. It was the most terrifying smile Ethan had ever seen. Cold. Calculating. The smile of a man who'd just decided exactly how to destroy someone and was looking forward to it. Security, William said calmly, not taking his eyes off Ethan. Call security. I want this child removed from the premises immediately. And find his mother. I want her fired. Effective right now. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. No, please. You want to talk about consequences? William's voice was silk over steel. Let me teach you about consequences. Your mother will never work in this city again. I'll make sure of it. I'll make sure every building, every company, every person who might hire her knows that Grace Rivers raised a thief who damages priceless property. I didn't damage anything, Ethan shouted, tears finally breaking through his defenses. I played one chord, one perfect chord, and it was beautiful, and you can't take that away from me no matter how much money you have. Enough, William roared. Security! Now! 2 security guards started moving toward the piano, their faces professional masks that revealed nothing about what they thought of this scene. Ethan's mind raced. His mother would lose her job. They'd lose their apartment. They were already 2 months behind on rent. Emma, his little sister, was at home right now doing homework at a table missing one leg, eating generic mac and cheese for the 3rd time this week. If his mother lost this job... Wait! A new voice cut through the chaos. Everyone turned. A man in his 70s stepped out of the crowd. He was shorter than William, dressed more simply, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But something about the way he moved made people step aside automatically, made even William Huntington III pause. "Professor Bennett," William said, his voice suddenly cautious. "This doesn't concern you." "I think it does," Professor James Bennett said quietly. He walked toward the piano, toward Ethan, studying the boy with an intensity that made Ethan want to shrink and stand tall simultaneously. "Did I hear correctly that you taught yourself music theory from books?" Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. "And you practice on a broken keyboard? 4 hours daily?" Another nod. Professor Bennett was the director of the Manhattan Conservatory of Music, one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. Ethan had read about him in library books, knew that Bennett had taught some of the greatest living pianists, that getting accepted to his program was harder than getting into Harvard. "Play something," Professor Bennett said simply. "What?" Ethan and William said simultaneously. "Play something, on the piano." Professor Bennett gestured to the Steinway. "If you're going to be arrested for touching it, you might as well be arrested for actually playing it." "Absolutely not," William sputtered. "James, you can't be serious." "I'm completely serious." Professor Bennett's voice carried quiet authority. "This boy claims he knows music. You claim he's a vandal. Let's settle it definitively, one piece. Then we'll know the truth." The crowd murmured with interest. This was unexpected entertainment, better than speeches about charitable contributions. William's face worked through several expressions. He wanted to refuse, but Professor Bennett wasn't just anyone. He was old money himself, the Bennett family legacy matching the Huntingtons. And more importantly, he had the respect of every person in this room. Refusing him would look petty. "Fine," William said through clenched teeth. "Let the boy embarrass himself. But when he proves he's just another delusional kid with delusions of grandeur, he's arrested. Agreed?" Professor Bennett ignored him, focusing entirely on Ethan. "What's your name, son?" "Ethan. Ethan Rivers." "Ethan, I want you to play something you know well, something you've practiced. Don't try to impress anyone. Just play what's in your heart." Ethan looked at the piano, then at the crowd of people waiting to judge him, then back at Professor Bennett's kind, patient eyes. His mother was going to lose her job either way now. The moment he'd sat at this piano, he'd sealed both their fates. William Huntington III didn't make empty threats. So if this was the end, if this was his first and last time playing a real piano, he was going to make it count. Ethan sat down at the bench. His hands trembled as they found their positions on the keys. The crowd pressed closer, phones appearing, ready to record his humiliation. He took a breath, closed his eyes, and let 3 years of desperate hope, painful practice, and impossible dreams flow through his fingers. The first notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata whispered into the ballroom like a secret being told, and the entire world stopped breathing. The first notes fell into the ballroom like raindrops on glass, soft, crystalline, impossibly delicate. Ethan's fingers moved across the keys with a gentleness that seemed to contradict everything about his appearance, his circumstances, his entire existence in this golden room. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the piece every beginner thinks they can play, and every master knows is nearly impossible to play well. The opening movement demanded something most pianists spent decades learning: restraint. The ability to hold back, to let silence breathe between notes, to understand that what you don't play is as important as what you do. Ethan understood. His small, calloused hands that had scrubbed dishes and hauled trash and practiced on broken keys until they bled, moved with the confidence of someone who'd lived inside this music for years. The triplet pattern in his right hand flowed like water, each note perfectly even, perfectly weighted. His left hand provided the harmonic foundation, rich and full, the bass notes resonating through the Steinway's frame like a heartbeat. But it was more than technical perfection. There was something in the way Ethan played that made the music feel inevitable, like he wasn't creating it, but discovering it, like the notes had always existed in the air, and he was simply revealing them to everyone else. The crowd, which moments ago had been laughing and whispering and recording Ethan's humiliation, fell into absolute silence. William Huntington III's smug expression began to falter. His mouth, which had been curved in that cruel smile, slowly straightened. His eyes, which had been narrowed with contempt, widened slightly. Professor Bennett stood perfectly still, his hand pressed to his chest, his eyes closed. Anyone who knew him would recognize the gesture. It's what he did when he heard something extraordinary, when music affected him so deeply that he needed to literally hold his heart in place. Ethan's fingers danced through the first movement, building tension note by note, phrase by phrase. The Steinway responded to his touch like it had been waiting for him. Every dynamic shift, every subtle rubato, every moment of suspension and release, all of it flowed from Ethan's hands with the kind of maturity that shouldn't have been possible for someone his age. A woman in a diamond necklace lowered her champagne glass slowly, transfixed. A man in a tuxedo stopped mid-conversation, his mouth still open, words forgotten. A teenager who'd been scrolling on her phone looked up, drawn by something she couldn't explain. This wasn't supposed to be possible. This dirty kid in oversized clothes, this child who'd learned from library books and a broken keyboard, wasn't supposed to be able to do this. But he was doing it. The music swelled, the melody lines singing out above the accompaniment, filled with such profound melancholy that it seemed to pull memories from everyone listening, memories of loss, of longing, of beautiful things that had slipped away. Several people found themselves blinking back tears without understanding why. Ethan transitioned into the second movement, the allegretto, and the character of the music changed entirely. Where the first movement had been contemplative and sad, the second was urgent, almost aggressive. His fingers flew across the keys, the left hand pounding out a relentless rhythm while the right hand wove melodic patterns that climbed and fell like waves. This was where most young pianists fell apart. The tempo was unforgiving, the fingerwork complex, the physical demands exhausting. It required not just speed, but control, not just power, but precision. Ethan played it flawlessly. His small frame seemed to grow larger at the piano, his shoulders set with determination, his face flushed with concentration, and something else. Something that looked like joy mixed with desperation, like he was trying to fit an entire lifetime of music into these few minutes because he knew they might be all he'd ever get. The crowd pressed closer, phones forgotten now, champagne abandoned on silver trays. They watched Ethan's hands blur across the keys, watched his body sway with the music, watched him pour 3 years of lonely practice and impossible dreams into this one perfect performance. In the back of the ballroom, near the service entrance, Grace Rivers stood frozen. She'd been summoned by security, told her son had caused a disturbance, and had run from the basement expecting the worst. But when she arrived, she found this. Her Ethan, her beautiful boy, playing a piano worth more than their lives, playing music she didn't even know he'd learned. Tears streamed down her face. All those nights she'd come home at 3 a.m. to find him asleep with a music theory book under his pillow. All those mornings she'd woken to find him already at that broken keyboard, practicing before school. All those times he'd asked her about composers, and she'd had no answers, only encouragement, only faith that his passion meant something, even when she couldn't understand it. She understood now. Professor Bennett opened his eyes, and what William Huntington III saw in them made his blood run cold. It was recognition, certainty, the look of a master who'd just discovered something rare, something precious, something that couldn't be faked or bought. The third movement began, presto agitato, fast and agitated, the most famous part of the Moonlight Sonata, the movement that had been played millions of times by millions of pianists and almost never played correctly. Ethan's fingers attacked the keys with controlled fury. The famous arpeggios tumbled out like thunderstorms, fast and dark and absolutely precise. His right hand flew through passages that required fingers to move independently at impossible speeds, each note clear and articulate despite the tempo. His left hand provided dramatic punctuation, crashing chords that made the entire piano resonate. This wasn't just technical mastery. This was interpretation. This was artistry. Ethan played with an understanding of the music's emotional architecture that most conservatory students didn't develop until their 20s. He knew when to push forward and when to hold back, when to let the piano sing and when to make it roar. He understood that Beethoven wasn't just showing off technical skill, he was expressing rage, frustration, rebellion against the deafness that was stealing his ability to hear the very music he created. And somehow, impossibly, Ethan channeled all of that. He channeled his own rage at poverty, his frustration with a world that judged him by his clothes instead of his heart, his rebellion against people like William Huntington III who believed some dreams belonged only to certain people. The music built and built, climbing toward its climax. Ethan's entire body engaged now, rocking slightly with the rhythm, his face a mask of fierce concentration. Sweat appeared on his forehead despite the ballroom's perfect climate control. His breath came in short gasps between phrases. And then, the final passage. The descending arpeggios that ended the piece, played pianissimo, soft and controlled, despite the exhaustion that must be screaming through his arms and hands. Ethan's fingers whispered across the keys, each note perfect, each phrase shaped with exquisite care, bringing the tempest down to a gentle rain, then to silence. The final chord hung in the air. C-sharp minor, dark, unresolved, perfect. Ethan lifted his hands from the keys slowly, like someone waking from a dream. His chest heaved as he caught his breath. His fingers trembled from the exertion. The silence that followed was absolute. 5 seconds passed. 10, 15. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The moment was so fragile that any sound might shatter it into pieces. Then Professor Bennett began to clap. Slow applause. Deliberate. The kind of applause reserved for performances that transcend technique and touch something fundamental about what it means to be human. A woman in the front row joined him. Then another. Then a man who'd been recording on his phone, his hands shaking as he clapped. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted in applause so thunderous it seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers. People weren't just clapping. They were standing, shouting, some openly crying. The woman with the diamond necklace was sobbing into her hands. The man in the tuxedo stood with his mouth open, applauding mechanically, his face showing shock that bordered on religious experience. Ethan sat at the piano bench, stunned. He'd never heard applause before, never performed for anyone except his broken keyboard and the walls of his tiny apartment. The sound washed over him like a wave, threatening to drown him in its intensity. Grace Rivers pushed through the crowd, running toward her son. She didn't care about protocol or rules or who saw her. She reached Ethan and pulled him into her arms, both of them crying now, holding each other while the ballroom thundered around them. "My baby," Grace whispered into his hair. "My beautiful, brilliant baby. Where did you learn to do that?" "Library books, Mom," Ethan said through his tears. "Just like I told you. Library books and YouTube and practicing, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I got you in trouble." "Shh," Grace held him tighter. "You didn't do anything wrong. You were magnificent." Professor Bennett approached them, and the crowd quieted, sensing something important was about to happen. "Young man," Bennett said, his voice thick with emotion. "What's your name again?" "Ethan Rivers, sir." "Ethan Rivers." Bennett repeated it like he was memorizing it, like he knew it was a name he'd be saying for years to come. "I've been teaching piano for 47 years. I've trained prodigies, concert pianists, Grammy winners. I've heard thousands of auditions from students who've had private lessons since age 3, who've attended prestigious prep schools, who've had every advantage money can provide." He paused, making sure everyone in the ballroom was listening. "I have never, not once in 47 years, heard anyone your age play with that level of maturity, interpretation, and technical mastery. Not one of my scholarship students, not one of my prodigies, no one." The crowd murmured with astonishment. "You taught yourself from library books?" Bennett asked. Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. "And you practiced on a broken keyboard?" Another nod. Professor Bennett turned to address the entire ballroom, but his words were clearly aimed at one person in particular. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we just witnessed is the rarest thing in music. Not talent. Talent is common enough. Not even genius. Genius appears more often than people think. What we witnessed was something that cannot be taught, cannot be bought, cannot be manufactured with expensive lessons and perfect instruments." He looked directly at William Huntington III. "We witnessed passion, pure, undiluted passion for music. The kind of love for art that makes a child practice 4 hours daily on broken keys. The kind of dedication that drives someone to learn complex theory from books without a teacher. The kind of soul-deep connection to music that money can never, ever purchase. William's face had gone from red to white to gray. He stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides, watching his entire worldview collapse in real time. "This boy," Professor Bennett continued, his hand on Ethan's shoulder, "has more musicality in his smallest finger than most of my students develop in a lifetime. And he did it alone, with no resources, no support, nothing but love for music and the determination to learn." He turned back to Ethan and Grace. "Mrs. Rivers, is it?" "Yes, sir," Grace said, still holding Ethan. "I'd like to offer your son a full scholarship to the Manhattan Conservatory of Music. Full tuition, living stipend, instrument access, private lessons, everything, starting immediately." The crowd gasped. A scholarship to Manhattan Conservatory was worth over $200,000. Students competed globally for positions. The acceptance rate was less than 3%. Grace couldn't form words. She looked at Ethan, then back at Professor Bennett. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. Your son is extraordinary. I want him in my program before someone else discovers him." Ethan felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. Full scholarship. Manhattan Conservatory. Everything he'd dreamed about during those 4-hour practice sessions, everything he'd imagined while reading books about Chopin and Liszt, it was real. It was happening. But William Huntington III finally found his voice. "James, you can't be serious. This boy trespassed. He damaged property. He played the most moving performance I've heard in a decade." Bennett cut him off coldly. "And if you try to press charges against him, William, I will make it my personal mission to ensure everyone knows that you attempted to arrest a child for the crime of being talented while poor." The threat hung in the air. Professor Bennett might be quiet and kind, but his social power was undeniable. A public feud with him would destroy William's reputation far more effectively than any lawsuit. William opened his mouth, then closed it. His face worked through several expressions: rage, humiliation, impotent fury. Finally, he turned and walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against marble, the crowd parting for him like water around a stone. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody even looked at him. All eyes were on Ethan Rivers, the boy who'd taught himself to play piano from library books, who'd just brought a ballroom full of cynics to tears, who'd proven that talent and passion could exist anywhere, even in places where no one thought to look. Grace held her son while he cried tears of relief and joy and overwhelming gratitude. Around them, the elite of Manhattan continued to applaud, many of them now understanding that they'd just witnessed something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. And in the corner, a teenage girl with blonde hair watched the scene with tears streaming down her face. Caroline Huntington, William's daughter, stared at Ethan Rivers and felt something crack inside her own carefully constructed world. She'd spent her entire life at the conservatory her father had donated millions to, taking private lessons with the best teachers money could buy. She practiced 2 hours a day in a music room filled with instruments that cost more than cars, and she'd never, not once, played anything that sounded like what that boy had just created. The truth was devastating and liberating all at once. Money couldn't buy what Ethan Rivers had. It couldn't buy passion. It couldn't buy soul. It couldn't buy the kind of love for music that made magic happen on piano keys. Caroline wiped her eyes and made a decision. She was going to find that boy. She was going to learn from him. And she was going to become the kind of musician who played with heart instead of just technical precision. But that would come later. For now, Ethan Rivers simply stood in the center of the ballroom, held by his mother, surrounded by applause, feeling for the first time in his life that maybe, just maybe, his dreams weren't impossible after all. 3 days after the gala, Ethan Rivers walked through the iron gates of the Manhattan Conservatory of Music for the first time as a student. The building looked like a cathedral, all Gothic arches and stained glass windows that threw colored light across stone floors worn smooth by a century of footsteps. He clutched the acceptance letter in his pocket like a talisman, still half convinced someone would realize they'd made a mistake and send him back to his broken keyboard and library books. Grace had cried when they'd received the scholarship paperwork. Full tuition, housing stipend, meal plan, private lessons with Professor Bennett himself. Everything that had seemed impossible 72 hours ago was now real. typed out in official letterhead that Grace kept touching like she needed to verify it was solid. "You earned this," she told Ethan that morning, straightening his new shirt, the first new clothes he'd owned in 2 years. "Don't you dare think otherwise." But as Ethan stepped into the conservatory's main hall, watching students his age carry instrument cases that cost more than his mother made in 6 months, he felt that old familiar feeling creeping back. He didn't belong here. "Ethan Rivers?" A woman in her 30s approached, clipboard in hand, professional smile in place. "I'm Ms. Chen, Student Services Coordinator. Professor Bennett asked me to give you the orientation tour." Her eyes were kind, but Ethan caught the quick assessment, taking in his discount store jeans, his still too big shirt, the backpack he'd gotten from a church donation drive. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly. The tour was overwhelming. Practice rooms with Steinway grands in every one. A concert hall with acoustics so perfect you could hear a pin drop from the stage to the back row. A library filled with original manuscripts, actual handwritten scores by Mozart, Chopin, Rachmaninoff. Students passed them in the halls, chatting casually about summer programs in Vienna and master classes in Paris, dropping names of famous musicians like they were discussing the weather. "And this is the student lounge," Ms. Chen said, opening double doors to reveal a space that looked like a luxury hotel lobby. Leather couches, grand piano in the corner, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. A group of students sat clustered around the piano. One of them was playing, something complex and showy, fingers flying across the keys while the others watched with expressions ranging from admiration to barely concealed jealousy. Then the girl playing looked up and saw Ethan. She stopped mid-phrase, hands freezing above the keys. Caroline Huntington. Ethan recognized her from the gala, the blonde girl who'd been crying in the corner after his performance. William Huntington's daughter. The room went silent. Every student turned to stare at Ethan, and he realized with sinking certainty that word had spread. They all knew who he was. The scholarship kid. The one who'd humiliated one of their biggest donors. The boy from nowhere who'd gotten a full ride for playing one piece at a party. "You're him," Caroline said, standing up from the piano bench. She walked toward Ethan, and he braced himself for confrontation, for accusations, for anger on her father's behalf. Instead, she stopped 3 feet away and said, "Teach me." Ethan blinked. "What?" "Teach me how you did it." Caroline's voice was intense, desperate. "How you played like that. I've had private lessons since I was 4. I practice 2 hours every day. I've studied with the best teachers money can buy, and I've never—" Her voice cracked. "I've never made anyone cry. I've never made anyone feel anything. You did it in 5 minutes, with no training, no resources, nothing. So teach me. Please." The other students murmured amongst themselves. Ms. Chen looked like she wanted to intervene, but didn't know how. Ethan stared at Caroline Huntington, daughter of the man who'd tried to have him arrested, who'd mocked his mother, who'd said poor people didn't deserve to touch expensive things, and saw something he recognized. Something he'd seen in his own mirror every morning for 3 years. Hunger, not for food, but for something more. The desperation to be good at something that mattered, to create something beautiful in a world that felt increasingly ugly. "I don't know if I can teach you," Ethan said honestly. "I don't even know how I do it. I just feel the music, and I play what I feel." "Then teach me to feel it," Caroline said. "Whatever it costs." "My father—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "My father cut off my allowance after the gala. Said I embarrassed him by crying. Said if I want to continue studying music, I need to prove I'm serious. So I'll pay you whatever I can earn. I got a job at a coffee shop. I don't want your money," Ethan interrupted. Caroline looked stricken. "Then what do you want?" Ethan thought about it. About his mother cleaning toilets. About his broken keyboard. About 3 years of teaching himself because no one thought a kid like him deserved real lessons. About William Huntington III's face when the crowd had applauded. "I want you to understand something," Ethan said carefully. "Music isn't about technique. It's not about how many hours you practice or how expensive your piano is or who your teacher is. It's about why you're playing, what you're trying to say, who you're trying to reach." He looked around at the other students, all of them listening now, their expensive instruments forgotten. "When I played at the gala, I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was just grateful. Grateful to touch a real piano. Grateful my mom was alive to see it. Grateful for 3 seconds of beauty in a life that's been mostly hard. That gratitude, that's what people heard. Not my technique. The room was completely silent. Caroline's eyes filled with tears. I've never been grateful for my piano. I've never been grateful for any of it. It was just always there. Then maybe that's where you start, Ethan said softly. A slow clap echoed from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Professor Bennett standing there, his face unreadable. Mr. Rivers, he said, you've been a student here for exactly 47 minutes, and you've already taught your first master class. He stepped into the room. Perhaps you'd all like to hear what Ethan has to say about music, because I've spent 47 years teaching technique, and I'm beginning to think I've been teaching the wrong thing. Caroline looked at Ethan with something like hope. The other students leaned forward. Even Ms. Chen pulled out her phone to record, and Ethan Rivers, who 3 days ago had been a nobody with a broken keyboard, realized that maybe, just maybe, he had something to teach after all. Something more valuable than perfect technique or expensive instruments. He had perspective. He had gratitude. He had a reason to play that went deeper than competitions or careers or impressing wealthy donors. He had love for music that couldn't be bought or manufactured. And in a school full of privileged prodigies who'd never had to fight for anything, that made him the richest student in the room. The morning sun hadn't yet cleared the Manhattan skyline when Ethan arrived at the conservatory practice rooms. 6 a.m. The building was supposed to be locked, but Professor Bennett had given him a key card with a handwritten note. Real musicians don't keep office hours. Ethan had been at the conservatory for 2 weeks now, and sleep had become increasingly difficult. Not from stress or fear, but from the opposite, from the overwhelming need to make up for lost time. Every hour he wasn't playing felt like a betrayal of the gift he'd been given, of his mother's sacrifices, of the chance that had literally fallen into his lap when he'd sat at that piano during the gala. He let himself into practice room 7B, his favorite, the one with the older Steinway that had a slightly mellower tone than the newer models. The room was small, barely 8 by 10 feet, with soundproofed walls and a single window that looked out at nothing but another brick wall. But to Ethan, it was paradise. He sat at the bench and began his warm-ups. Scales, arpeggios, Hanon exercises. The technical foundations he'd learned from library books but never properly practiced because his broken keyboard couldn't sustain notes long enough. An hour passed. Then 2. He was deep into a Chopin nocturne when the door opened behind him. Ethan's hands froze mid-phrase. "Don't stop on my account," a man's voice said. Ethan turned to find William Huntington III standing in the doorway. His heart lurched into his throat. Fight-or-flight instinct screamed at him to run, to get away, to not be alone in a small room with the man who'd tried to have him arrested. But something kept him frozen on the bench. Maybe it was the way William looked. Smaller somehow than he'd seemed at the gala. Older. The arrogance that had surrounded him like armor was gone, replaced by something Ethan couldn't quite identify. "How did you get in here?" Ethan managed. "I donated $14 million to build the new performance wing," William said flatly. "They gave me a key." He stepped into the room, and Ethan noticed he was carrying something. A leather portfolio, expensive but worn with age. "I'm not here to threaten you," William continued, as if reading Ethan's mind. "Though I can see why you'd think that. I came to—" He stopped, jaw working like the words were physically difficult to produce. "I came to apologize." Ethan stared at him, certain he'd misheard. "The night of the gala," William said, not looking at Ethan but at the piano. "I said some unconscionable things to you, about your mother, about people I deemed lesser." He finally met Ethan's eyes. "I was wrong, spectacularly, publicly, humiliatingly wrong. And more than that, I was cruel." The silence that followed felt fragile, like glass stretched too thin. "Professor Bennett sent me a recording of your performance," William continued. "I've listened to it 47 times in the past 2 weeks. Do you know what I hear every time?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "I hear my mother." The words hung in the air, unexpected and raw. William moved to the window, staring at the brick wall beyond, like it held answers. "My mother was a pianist, a good one. She studied at Juilliard, performed with symphony orchestras, had a recording contract lined up. Then she met my father." He laughed bitterly. "He convinced her to give it up, Said it wasn't appropriate for a Huntington wife to work. Said she could play at charity functions if she wanted to indulge her hobby, but a career was out of the question. Ethan remained silent, sensing this confession needed space. She stopped playing professionally, stopped composing, eventually stopped playing altogether, except for those terrible charity galas where wealthy people talked through performances by artists they'd never heard of and never would again. William's hands clenched at his sides. She died when I was 25. Pneumonia. Very sudden. And do you know what I found in her music room after the funeral? He opened the leather portfolio he'd been carrying, pulled out yellowed sheets of music manuscript paper, covered in handwritten notes. Original compositions, 53 of them. Pieces she'd written in secret, hidden away because she knew my father, knew our entire social circle, would mock them, would tell her she was wasting her time, would remind her that Huntingtons were patrons of the arts, not practitioners. William held out one of the manuscripts to Ethan. The title read, Nocturne in G minor, for the dreams we bury. I never heard her play any of these, William said, his voice thick. Not once. She kept them hidden even from me, her own son. And after she died, I put them in a drawer and never looked at them again. Because looking at them meant confronting the fact that I'd been complicit, that I'd inherited my father's contempt for her passion, that I'd rolled my eyes when she practiced, that I'd complained when her playing interrupted my phone calls. He returned the manuscript to the portfolio carefully, like it might crumble to dust. When you played at the gala, when you poured everything you had into that piano, when you played like it was the only thing in the world that mattered, I didn't hear a talented kid. I heard my mother. I heard everything she'd buried, everything she'd sacrificed, everything I'd helped destroy by not valuing it. William finally looked at Ethan directly, and Ethan saw tears on the older man's face. I lashed out at you because you represented everything I'd failed to be for her. You were brave enough to claim your passion publicly. You fought for your music even when people like me told you that you didn't belong. And instead of admiring that, instead of protecting it, I tried to crush it, just like my father crushed hers. Ethan felt his own eyes burning. He thought about his mother, about Grace working 3 jobs so he could chase an impossible dream, about how she'd never once told him to be realistic, to give up, to accept that some doors would always be closed. Your mother is still alive, William said quietly. Grace, right? She still works here, cleaning offices in the administration building. Ethan nodded, uncertain where this was going. I've been watching her, William admitted. Not in a creepy way, he added quickly. Just observing. She works from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., 5 days a week. Then she takes the subway home, sleeps 4 hours, and goes to her day job at a laundromat. She does this so you can study here, so you can have this chance. I know, Ethan whispered. Do you? William's voice was gentle but firm. Do you really understand what she's sacrificing? Because I didn't understand what my mother gave up, until it was too late to thank her. Too late to tell her I was sorry for not seeing her, for not protecting her passion, for not standing up to my father and telling him that her music mattered more than our family's reputation. William sat down in the room's only chair, suddenly looking exhausted. I can't undo what I said to you at the gala. I can't take back the humiliation or the cruelty, but I can do something for your mother, something my father should have done for mine. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and held it out to Ethan. What is this? Ethan asked, not taking it. A job offer. For Grace. Administrative assistant position in my investment firm. 40-hour work week. Salary of $90,000 a year. Full benefits. She'd be home by 6 p.m. every night. She'd have weekends off. She'd have time to actually watch you perform, to see what her sacrifices created. Ethan stared at the envelope like it might bite him. Why would you do this? Because I can't save my mother, William said simply. But maybe I can honor her by making sure another mother, another woman who sacrificed everything for her child's dreams, doesn't work herself to death in the shadows. Ethan's hands trembled as he took the envelope. Inside was a formal offer letter. Grace Rivers' name typed at the top, benefits package detailed below. It was real, legitimate, life-changing. There's no catch, William said, reading Ethan's skepticism. She'd be working in HR, helping manage employee benefits. It's a real job that needs doing. She'd be good at it. Anyone who can manage the life she's been living can certainly manage employee scheduling and payroll oversight. I don't understand, Ethan said. 2 weeks ago you wanted me arrested. Now you're offering my mother a job that would... He couldn't finish. The implications were too enormous. 2 weeks ago I was a man who'd spent 30 years running from his own guilt, William said. Then I listened to you play, really listened, and I couldn't run anymore. Professor Bennett told me something after the gala. He said, "The boy plays like someone who understands what it means to lose everything, and that's what makes him great." William stood, moved toward the door, then paused. "I've never lost everything, Ethan. I've never lost anything. I inherited wealth, power, respect, all of it handed to me by a father who crushed beauty whenever he encountered it. And I became exactly like him." He turned back. "But maybe it's not too late to become someone else. Someone my mother would have been proud of. Someone who protects passion instead of destroying it." "Does Caroline know you're here?" Ethan asked suddenly. William's expression softened at his daughter's name. "She doesn't. Caroline and I haven't spoken much since the gala. She's angry with me. Rightfully so. She got a job at a coffee shop to pay for extra lessons. Did you know that? My daughter, working retail because I punished her for having emotions. She's a good person," Ethan said. "She wants to learn. Really learn. Not just technique, but why music matters." "Then teach her," William said. "Teach her what my mother never got to teach me. And maybe someday, when I've proven I'm not the monster I was at that gala, you'll both forgive me." He placed a business card on top of the piano. "Have your mother call that number. The position starts whenever she's ready. And Ethan," William's voice cracked, "thank you. For playing that night. For being brave enough to sit at that piano despite people like me. You saved something in me I thought was dead." William Huntington III walked out of the practice room, leaving Ethan alone with a job offer that would change his mother's life and a leather portfolio full of music that had never been heard. Ethan looked down at the manuscripts, at the careful notes written by a woman who'd hidden her passion because the world had told her it didn't matter. He thought about his own mother, about Grace scrubbing floors while he played Steinways, about the parallel lives of women who sacrificed everything for ungrateful worlds. Then he did the only thing that made sense. He sat at the piano and played. He played for William's mother, whose music had died in a drawer. He played for his own mother, who was probably asleep right now after another double shift. He played for Caroline, who was learning that privilege without passion was just a prettier prison. He played for Professor Bennett, who'd recognized something valuable in a dirty kid at a gala. But mostly, he played for himself, for the scared boy who'd touched a piano and found his purpose, for every person who'd been told they didn't belong, didn't deserve, didn't matter. The music filled the tiny practice room, spilled into the empty hallway, rose through the floors of the conservatory like a prayer. And somewhere in the building, Caroline Huntington heard it and began to cry. Not from sadness this time, from hope. 6 months had passed since that morning in the practice room. 6 months since Grace Rivers had walked into a job interview wearing her best church dress and walked out with a career that gave her weekends, health insurance, and the ability to attend every single one of Ethan's performances. Tonight was the biggest performance yet, the conservatory's annual winter concert at Carnegie Hall. 2,000 seats, sold out weeks in advance, filled with music critics, industry professionals, and families who'd flown in from across the country to watch their children perform. Backstage, Ethan adjusted his bow tie for the 10th time, his hands trembling despite 6 months of rigorous training. Professor Bennett had entered him in the competition for the Kaufman Scholarship, a $50,000 prize awarded to the most promising young pianist. The winner would be announced tonight after all the performances. "You're going to be magnificent," Grace said, straightening his collar even though it didn't need straightening. She looked different now, healthier, with color in her cheeks and rest in her eyes. The permanent exhaustion that had defined her for years had faded, replaced by something Ethan had never seen in her before. Peace. "What if I mess up?" Ethan whispered. "What if I freeze out there?" "Then you'll be human," Grace said simply. "But Ethan, listen to me." She took his face in her hands, those hands that had scrubbed 1,000 floors, that had worked until they bled so he could dream. "You've already won. Not the scholarship. I mean, you've already won at life. You found what you love. You found your purpose. Everything else is just details. A knock on the dressing room door interrupted them. Caroline Huntington poked her head in, looking nervous in her own performance dress. "They're calling 5 minutes," she said, then added, "You're going to kill it, Ethan." Over the past 6 months, Caroline had become one of Ethan's closest friends. She'd quit the conservatory's competitive track and started studying music therapy instead, using piano to help kids in hospitals, in shelters, in places where beauty was scarce. She'd found her own purpose, different from Ethan's but equally valid. "You too," Ethan said. "Your Debussy is perfect." Caroline smiled, but there was something else in her expression. "My dad's here, in the audience, front row." Ethan's eyebrows rose. William Huntington III hadn't attended a conservatory event since the gala. He'd kept his distance, respecting the space Ethan and Caroline needed, quietly donating to scholarship funds and employee benefit programs without seeking recognition. "He brought something," Caroline continued. "The manuscripts, his mother's compositions. He gave them to Professor Bennett. He wants them performed, wants the world to hear what she created." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "That's 5 minutes, Mr. Rivers," a stage manager called. Grace hugged her son one more time, fierce and quick. "Go show them what happens when you give a dreamer a chance." The walk to the stage wings felt both endless and too short. Ethan could hear the crowd murmuring beyond the curtain, could feel the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. 6 months ago, he'd been a kid with a broken keyboard. Now he was about to play Carnegie Hall. Professor Bennett appeared beside him. "Nervous?" "Terrified," Ethan admitted. "Good. Terror means you care. Terror means it matters." Bennett placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I've taught hundreds of students, Ethan. Prodigies, virtuosos, musicians who went on to win international competitions. But I've never taught anyone who understands music the way you do. Not the notes. Anyone can learn notes. You understand why we play. You understand that music is a bridge between human souls. What if I'm not ready?" "You've been ready since the moment you touched that piano at the gala," Bennett said. "You just didn't know it yet." The stage lights came up. The audience quieted. An announcer's voice filled the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor, accompanied by the Manhattan Conservatory Orchestra, Ethan Rivers." Ethan walked onto the stage. 2,000 people, every seat filled. He found his mother in the third row, Grace crying before he'd even played a note. Next to her sat Mrs. Rodriguez from his old building, Caroline's father, William, and Professor Bennett's wife. Behind them, he spotted students from the conservatory, teachers, people whose faces he'd come to know over 6 months of early mornings and late nights in practice rooms. But in the front row, in the seat of honor usually reserved for major donors, sat someone unexpected. An elderly woman in an elegant dress, her white hair styled perfectly, her eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that made him pause. Professor Bennett caught his confusion and whispered from the wings, "Mrs. Eleanor Kaufman, the scholarship donor. She's 93 years old and hasn't attended a performance in 5 years. She came specifically to hear you." Ethan sat at the 9-foot Steinway Model D, the same model he'd touched for the first time at the gala, but this one was even more magnificent. He adjusted the bench, placed his fingers on the keys, looked at the conductor, who raised his baton. Then, in the split second before the music began, Ethan thought about everyone who'd brought him to this moment. His mother, who'd sacrificed everything. Professor Bennett, who'd seen potential where others saw poverty. Caroline, who'd taught him that privilege could be transformed into purpose. William, who'd proven people could change. Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd kept Emma safe during those long nights. Even William Huntington III, whose cruelty had inadvertently launched everything. The baton came down. Ethan played. The Rachmaninoff Second Piano Concerto is notoriously difficult, sweeping romantic melodies that require both technical precision and deep emotional interpretation. It's a piece about struggle and triumph, about darkness giving way to light, about the human capacity to overcome. Ethan poured everything into it. Every hour of practice on a broken keyboard. Every night his mother came home too exhausted to speak. Every moment of doubt when he'd wondered if dreaming was foolish. Every second of gratitude when he'd realized dreams could come true if someone gave you a chance. The orchestra swelled around him. The piano sang beneath his fingers. The music built and crashed and soared and wept, telling a story without words, communicating truths that language couldn't capture. In the audience, Grace Rivers sobbed openly, not from sadness but from overwhelming pride. William Huntington III wiped his eyes, thinking of his mother, wondering what she could have accomplished if someone had believed in her. Caroline recorded on her phone, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Rodriguez clutched her purse, remembering a little boy asking for extra bread, now transformed into this. And in the front row, Eleanor Kaufman sat perfectly still, her aged hands gripping the armrests, her face revealing nothing. But her eyes told everything. She was seeing something she'd waited 93 years to witness. Pure, unfiltered passion meeting perfect opportunity. The final movement arrived, the triumphant conclusion. Ethan's hands flew across the keys, the orchestra reaching its climax, 2,000 people holding their breath as music and moment and meaning collided into something transcendent. The final chord rang out, powerful, definitive, perfect. Silence. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then Carnegie Hall exploded. The standing ovation was instantaneous and deafening. 2,000 people on their feet, applauding, shouting, crying. The orchestra members tapped their bows against their music stands in the traditional show of respect. Professor Bennett stood in the wings openly weeping. Grace pushed through the crowd trying to reach the stage. Ethan stood at the piano, overwhelmed, tears streaming down his face, unable to process that this was real. This was his life. This was what happened when passion met opportunity. The applause continued for 7 minutes. 7 full minutes of celebration, not just for a performance, but for what the performance represented. Proof that talent existed everywhere, that genius wasn't limited by zip code, that giving someone a chance could change everything. Finally, Eleanor Kaufman made her way slowly onto the stage. The audience quieted, sensing something important. "Ethan Rivers," she said, her voice amplified by a microphone, surprisingly strong for someone her age. "I established this scholarship 60 years ago in memory of my sister, who was a gifted pianist. She died young, never having the opportunities she deserved. I created this fund to ensure talented young people would never face the barriers she faced." She paused, looking directly at Ethan. "In 60 years, I've awarded this scholarship to 87 pianists. Many went on to significant careers. Some teach at prestigious institutions. Several perform internationally. But tonight, for the first time, I'm changing the rules." The audience murmured with surprise. "Tonight, I'm not just awarding $50,000, Eleanor continued. "Tonight, I'm establishing the Ethan Rivers Fellowship, a full scholarship program for talented students from underprivileged backgrounds. Mr. Rivers will be the first recipient, and every year going forward, we'll find more students like him, more dreamers who need a chance." She turned to address the audience. "Because what I witnessed tonight wasn't just technical mastery. It was a reminder that we've been looking for genius in the wrong places. We've been cultivating talent in the same gardens while diamonds lay buried in fields we never thought to explore." Eleanor placed a medal around Ethan's neck, the Kaufman Medal, given only 5 times in 60 years. "Don't just be a musician, Ethan," she said softly, so only he could hear. "Be proof. Be evidence that we need to change how we find talent, how we nurture it, how we give chances to those who deserve them." The applause started again, but Ethan barely heard it. He was looking at his mother, who'd finally made it to the side of the stage, her face radiant with joy and relief and vindication. He was looking at Caroline, who was applauding so hard her hands must hurt. At William, who mouthed, "Thank you," across the distance. At Professor Bennett, who simply nodded, a teacher watching his student become something more. Ethan thought about that night 6 months ago, walking into a gala where he didn't belong, touching a piano he shouldn't have touched, playing music that changed everything. He thought about the words William had shouted at him, "Get away from that piano!" And he thought about how glad he was that he hadn't listened. Because sometimes, the biggest mistake you can make is believing people who tell you that you don't belong. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit down at that piano anyway, touch those keys anyway, play your heart out anyway. Sometimes one moment of courage can change not just your life, but the lives of everyone who comes after you. Ethan Rivers walked off the stage at Carnegie Hall that night not as the poor kid who'd gotten lucky, but as the musician who'd proven that talent doesn't require a pedigree. That passion matters more than privilege. That dreams are valid regardless of where they're dreamed. Behind him on the piano, Professor Bennett placed a single sheet of music, the first of William's mother's compositions, finally ready to be heard by the world. The title read, "For the Dreams We Bury." But tonight, in Carnegie Hall, they'd proven something more important. Some dreams refuse to stay buried. Some dreams, given one chance, will rise and soar and change the world. And all they need is someone brave enough to sit down at the piano and play.